the majority of the cities that I lived in were on the coast, so it's kind of like southwest over by Rotterdam, Den Haag, Utrecht. That kind of was all like in the southwest. So I definitely choose to live in that area just because that's where the majority of the population is. It's where the majority of universities are, and the public transportation is the best down there. In Emmen, in that farm town up in the east that I was living in, we got stuck several times without a bus for like an hour. We would just be sitting at a bus stop for an hour. But down in the southwest, it's not like that at all. It's very convenient. So I definitely choose to live in that region. But picking a specific city, I'd probably pick Utrecht just because it has a perfect mix of being beautiful, like old city center, and lots of touristy places, but it also has a university. It has other parts of the city that are more metropolitan, and then it also has suburbs. So it's like a good mix of everything, and it's central enough that you can get anywhere. I started off by living in Den Haag, and in Den Haag, it's one of the bigger cities, but it's really full of international people. It's very full of refugees. So when we would go talk to people on the streets, it would be a lot of Turkish people or Africans. And so communicating in Dutch was a little more difficult in that city. And then I moved to a city called Zoetermeer, which is smaller. It's still a city, but also kind of a farm town. It was a very small city, but it still had so many people living there. So in the Netherlands, one thing about their architecture is individual houses, like on a street, that doesn't really exist. It's like one building will be 10 or so apartments, and that'll cover a block of land, and then it'll be the next one, 10 more apartments, and it's like stacked up on top of each other. Everybody's living in very close quarters in the Netherlands. And so that was something that was really unique to Zoetermeer, is even though it was a small city, there were still tons of people that lived there just because of that living situation of being so close to each other. Then after I was in Zoetermeer, I moved to a city called Amersfoort, and Amersfoort has a really, really old city center. It was absolutely gorgeous. Actually, the second half of the name is Fort. Same thing in English, it's Fort. And so it was surrounded by walls and by a moat, and that was absolutely beautiful. After Amersfoort, I moved to Utrecht, which is a very big student city. There's a really big university there. Whenever we were outside at night, there were bars that were open, and you could just hear these college students yelling and having a good time, going to parties. The craziest thing that happened while I was in Utrecht, though, was I was there for New Year's Eve. And New Year's Eve in the Netherlands is insane, because they don't really have a lot of like laws for their fireworks, or maybe if they do, they don't follow them. I'm not entirely sure, but everybody has fireworks that they are lighting off in the streets on New Year's Eve. So the next morning, if you go outside, there's just like the plastic shells of fireworks everywhere. It's just scattered everywhere. But I remember standing on the balcony with my companion, Sister May, and we were watching the fireworks from the city center, and it was just like, if you just listened to it, it kind of sounded like a war zone, but if you looked at it, it was just magical because there were fireworks everywhere. The sky was lit up with all of these colors, and it like looked like sparkles all over the sky. It was so cool. So that was something super cool about living in a big city during New Year's Eve. The only downside of that was that if you were outside on New Year's Eve, then there would be those 14-year-old boys that would shoot off fireworks. And we were actually outside that night going to somebody's house, and my companion got hit in the chest with a firework. Like, it was a tiny, tiny firework, so it didn't actually hurt her, but she could not hear for the rest of the evening. So that was probably the most insane thing about Utrecht. And after I lived there, I moved to a tiny farm town called Emmen, and that was right up on the German border, and it was the smallest town that I served in. We would ride our bikes max 5 minutes. We were outside of the city, and it was just farmland out there, and it was so, so beautiful. And at the time, I think that was the end of summertime, so I got to see like the changing of the leaves there, and it was still very green when I first got there. And I remember my companion and I, we would just ride our bikes out there on our free time, and we would just like go pet the cows on the farms. And at one point my companion really wanted to see what it was like to touch an electric fence, so she did. And we would just like take pictures in the giant green fields. So I loved that city too.